We were somewhere near Montana on Amtrak when the caffeine began to take hold. The sun was rising, the Wi-Fi was non-existent, and someone had just managed to boot a Rails app at 75 miles per hour. 16 of us, laptops open, Rails apps booting in a moving train car, en route to the very first RailsConf. And we were all in on this new framework. But we'll come back to this ride later. Today I'm going to take you on a little bit of a trip. So Rails has been around for over 21 years now, and in that time it's introduced a lot of features. Some we still use to this day, some we've forgotten about, some maybe we wish we could forget about. But together they tell a story, not just of the framework, but of the community behind it. Rails has always moved fast. It's held strong opinions, it has bold defaults, and has made the occasional curious detour. Today we're going to take a ride through some of that history today. We'll make a few stops along the way. Some will feel familiar, others might bring back some memories, but this isn't about pointing fingers or poking fun. It's about understanding how Rails has evolved and how it's helped us evolve as developers too. So here's how this is going to work. I'm going to take us through a handful of stops, moments in Rails histories that mark big ideas, big swings, or maybe just some big personalities. Some features we still love, some we quietly extracted, and some newer developers stumble across in our code bases like they're artifacts from a forgotten civilization. And in the spirit of Rails itself, we'll keep moving. So grab your bags and hop on board. We're headed back where things started clicking, a time when Rails gave us structure, momentum, and maybe even a little bit of magic. So let's roll into stop one, where we jumped on board. This is where Rails hooked us. You could scaffold a model, validate some user input, set up a few relationships, and run your tests all in the first hour or 15 minutes if you were making a blog. The defaults were smart, the opinions were helpful, and the feedback loop was lightning quick. It felt like the framework truly wanted us to succeed. Now, these features didn't just save us time, they made building joyful. Now, one of Rails' biggest contributions wasn't a method or a class, it was a philosophy. Convention over configuration meant that if you just followed a few of these naming rules, folder naming structures, Rails would handle the rest. You didn't need a giant XML file to explain where your models or your controllers lived, and you just built your app and it worked. That shift saved us from so much boilerplate and let us focus on building features, not on wiring things together. Now, Active Record is arguably the most iconic piece of Rails. The name itself comes from Martin Fowler's book, Patterns of Enterprise Application Architecture, but in Rails, it wasn't just a pattern, it was the default way of getting shit done. With Active Record, you could write user.post, and you weren't thinking about foreign keys or join tables. You were thinking about what your user wanted to connect to. It made your data feel alive, not just some mysterious data stored in a hash cache in the cloud. Now, I feel like I should provide some context for what developers were navigating during this era. For example, if you're using Java ORM Hibernate around this time, here's kind of a high-level overview of what would go into that. Disclaimer, these are my best examples I can find from the 2004 era of Hibernate. But here's an equivalent of a domain object, say in Hibernate, for say an article. You define your getters, your setters, you could have a title, body, author, and then there's this thing called a Hibernate mapping XML file, which is where you'd map your Java class files to corresponding database columns. This is where you define one-to-many or many-to-one relationships. Then to interact with this in your app, you'd then use these setters, and you'd save your data in the database. Now you might be thinking, that doesn't actually look all that bad, right? It's only like 4 or 5 lines of code. But what happened if it didn't actually successfully save? For example, if you had a unique constraint on an article, you need to handle those types of exceptions, and any other data validations. We needed to write quite a bit of code for that business logic. And then one day, Active Record arrived. We didn't need to define all those getters and setters. No configuration. We could just toss in a few validations, and in a few lines of Ruby code, we were confidently adhering to our application's business logic without needing to wire up very much. Less boilerplate, less ceremony, more joy. Active Record wasn't just simpler, it felt human, because Rails invited us to write code that spoke clearly about what we wanted it to achieve. In my opinion, Rails console might be one of the most quietly powerful tools in the whole framework. You could poke around your app, run queries, debug some weirdness, no browser needed, no breakpoints, no scaffolding a controller just to test something out. And when things went sideways in production, it was there for you too. We can investigate issues on our servers, log in, fix a data issue without having to redeploy our application. That shrunk the feedback loop. It built up our confidence in understanding how this Ruby and Rails thing all kind of worked at the time. Now, before Rails, managing a database meant editing a bunch of SQL files, typically, writing altered table statements, saving them in a shared folder, maybe emailing them around with your coworkers. You never really knew if a change had been run in production yet. It was a very clunky era of database management. We pushed changes to production, or schema changes was clunky, and if you were working with a DBA, you probably had a pretty slow review loop too. Rollbacks if you were lucky. Active record migrations changed all that. Now schema changes were versioned and lived in our source control, and you can run them with just one command. And this built up our confidence that the local and production environment schemas were kind of aligned. Now Rails didn't just support testing, it kind of expected it. When you generated a model, it created a test file and a fixtures. No setup, no configuration, just some encouragement. That helped establish a habit. Teams started writing tests earlier and more often. And once testing became more normal, we had some cognitive bandwidth to start imagining maybe some new ways of thinking about testing, and that led to things like RSpec and BDD, whether you like them or not. But Rails never forced you to write tests. It just made it really easy to get started. Rails provided us with a bunch of helpers that quietly made our apps feel polished, requiring very little effort on our parts. You didn't need to write a bunch of custom logic for string truncation, currency formatting, thinking about pluralization. For example, in PHP around this era, it wasn't horrible. You could probably make a function for this or something, but it was kind of quite verbose to handle things like that. And then contrast that with Rails. These small little conveniences added up. They cleaned up our views. They made our apps more consistent, and they made it easier for teams to read and maintain each other's code base, and gave me kind of a business model. Now, one of the most thoughtful parts of Rails has always been how it's helped us speak to our users. Use .error.full messages, gives us friendly, human-readable validation messages without requiring us to write a bunch of if field blank, add error, then if error, display error, just built into the stack. And that flash hash, it gave us a built-in way to communicate success and information and failures between requests. Helpers weren't flashy, but they saved us time, simplified our views, and again, helped us create much better user experiences with such little effort on our part. Rails gave us a lot of thoughtful tools really on. A lot of those things still exist. All of those things still exist, and it doesn't look that much different. But these things made building web apps feel joyful and fast. But not every feature stuck around. Some were experiments, some didn't age well, and some just didn't work out the way that we hoped they would. Welcome to the quieter stuff. This is where Rails features arrive at purpose, sometimes even with fanfare. But over time, they proved to maybe not be quite the right fit. Some we've quietly extracted, or maybe they've faded from memory. Who here remembers Active Resource? Let me see your hands. Who used Active Resource in production? Okay. Who's still using Active Record in production? Active Resource? Okay, one. Okay, thank you. So Active Resource was ambitious. This was Rails' attempt to make one app talk to another over HTTP. Not a super novel idea in the modern time, but treating basically a remote API like it was an active record model. In theory, it was beautiful. You could just write invoice.find, and Rails would make a REST call under the hood. It worked quite nicely when we owned our own APIs. Active Record, or Active Resource, let us pretend that we had a distributed active record. But in the real world, other people are hell, and other people's APIs aren't quite so polite. They rate limit you, they return weird error messages, and they change their formats midweek. Things go up, flip upside down. And eventually Rails was like, you're probably going to want to handle this yourself. Today, we lean on things like Faraday or HTTP Party to build our own API clients for our Rails apps. Active Record Observers allowed us to extract all these side effect callbacks from our models and move them into some other class. It sounded cleaner for a while, especially, for example, if you had like an invoice and you wanted to sync it to QuickBooks, but you didn't want the invoice model to really know that QuickBooks existed. You could do that. You could have multiple observers observing the same model. Got a little crazy. You could save a record, update records, and something else would happen somewhere else, but where? You'd have to re-reference your environment files to figure out which ones were loaded, which environment, what order they were being loaded. In practice, it was a little implicit, maybe not widely used or understood, difficult to debug, and it fell out of favor. It was extracted in Rails 4. page and action caching were early attempts to speed up our Rails apps by skipping the controller entirely. The fastest Rails app is no Rails app, I think. For example, we might want to cache our articles, so we'd call cache this page in our controller. And with page caching, Rails would write the full HTML to the public directory on our app servers. So then there would be an HTML file there. And then on a subsequent request, Apache or Nginx would then serve that file without needing to hit Rails. It was fast. It was also brittle. If one partial changed, you had to expire the whole page or manually delete files in your servers. A lot of us had multiple app servers, so we had a lot of HTML files that were regularly trying to delete and keep cleaned and figuring out where the cache was broken. This is before we had tools like Memcache or Redis readily available. So Rails did what it could with the file system. But our apps got a little bit more dynamic. The approach didn't quite hold up so well. These caching features were extracted, and now we might look at using things like Russian doll caching in Redis or Solid Cache. Early Rails had something called dynamic scaffolding. You just drop in scaffold invoices, no files, no views. Rails would just auto-generate the CRUD interface at runtime. It was magical, or maybe a cool parlor trick. Until you needed to change something, it was a little tricky because there was nothing to actually change because it was automatically generated in real time. So Rails tended to outgrow this pretty quickly. That's why we got static scaffolding, the kind that actually gives you some files to work with. Same spirit, but a little bit more practical. Early on, Rails also gave us attr accessible to protect against mass attribute assignment. You'd whitelist which attributes could be updated and where. For example, let's say you had an editorial workflow where writers could draft an article, but only an editor could publish it. So we use attr accessible in our models for each role in our controllers. We'd have to pass that role context when we'd call active record to save our records and stuff like that. It was simple, but our apps tended to get a little more complicated, and a lot of teams were growing. And so suddenly tracking which fields were being used, exposed, and where got a little confusing. And so in Rails 4, we got strong parameters. It moved that logic into the controller where it was arguably easier to see and manage. Some folks didn't love this change at the time because it was challenging the skinny controller, fat model mindset. But I think it was a thoughtful shift. It's more explicit, more transparent, and a little safer for teams that are growing quickly. Now, these weren't failures. These were experiments. Rails trying to abstract, to simplify, to be clever. But at our next stop, Rails gets a little bit more playful. This is the stretch of track where Rails got even whimsical. Because it wasn't just about productivity, it was about delighting ourselves, at least, if anyone. Helpers that dance, features that felt like magic spells, clever, curious ideas that made us pause and smile. Some of these features were genuinely helpful when they came out. Others made things a little harder to understand in the long run. But at the time, they felt like it was one of our secret weapons. There was this time in Rails when we wrote JavaScript with Ruby. With RJS templates, your controllers would respond by writing Ruby. That would then output JavaScript. The important part was that we weren't writing JavaScript. You were just asking Rails to write it for you. We also had features like button to and link to function. You weren't linking to a URL. You were linking to a JavaScript function. It was fast. It felt powerful at the time. And it worked on most browsers, except for maybe some IE situations. But as our apps grew, our view started to get kind of messy. We also had observe field, which made our apps feel futuristic, at least for 2006 era. We used it for live search, autocomplete, tagging, you name it. For example, let's say we had a text field and we wanted to watch for user input every half second or so. That would fire off an AJAX request to a controller, and we could have that return a partial to render in our search results. No SPA needed. We had no build tooling, no gem files. This was just vanilla Rails. You could do all this. We loved that power. And we eventually also learned how to let things go once we, as a community, started to embrace unobtrusive JavaScript. Scriptaculous brought us animations and visual effects to our early Rails apps and made us feel so powerful. You could build shopping carts with literal drag and drop functionality. I remember being at a conference and seeing someone literally dragging a t-shirt into a shopping cart. I'm like, we all need that. That's the future of buying on the internet, is dragging to the thing instead of clicking add to cart. It's funny how things kind of reverb. Anyways, for a while this was pure crack cocaine for us backend developers that were getting a little crazy with our JavaScript, but it was there. But as the JavaScript ecosystem evolved, Rails decided to step back These effects weren't removed from being included with Rails because they were bad or anything. They just didn't need to be bundled by default anymore. We're always waiting on JavaScript things to, that was 2006. All right, one of the early Rails superpower was you could just write invoice.find by customer code and underscore number, and it would just magically work. These were called dynamic finders, method names that would turn into these queries for you. You didn't have to write the SQL, which was what we were trying to avoid as much as we could. You didn't need to configure anything, but method names started to get kind of long, started wrapping, and our queries tended to get a little bit more complicated than this. It's probably Rails doing a little bit too much behind the curtain, so we stepped back. Now we have explicit find by, where conditions, and use name scopes. But at the time, Rails was giving us something easy to reach for to keep it readable. But as you can see, we were also very verbose with our attribute names, so it made these method names really freaking long. And here's one you might not believe, but Rails briefly supported semicolon delimited actions. What the fuck does that mean? Like /books/ID semicolon edit. This approach was inspired by the Java servlet specs, something called matrix parameters. The idea is super simple. All right, so each segment of a URL path could carry its own metadata. Got it? You understand? Does that make sense? Anyone know how to read that? All right. Rails didn't go this deep with it, but this is in the Java servlet specs. We had this in Rails 1.1 and 1.2. It basically let us insert these semicolons in our routes to call custom actions that didn't quite fit cleanly into REST. And the idea was to discourage RPC-style actions. I'm just reading verbatim what I read on some track post. Track SVN was our old Rails place to deal with issues back then. Also, you can't find that stuff without using the Internet Archive, so thankful that that exists. But this confused a lot of devs like myself, broke in Safari, and were quietly extracted in Rails 2.0, as DHH said at the time, just not worth it. So Rails quietly let it go, and we just embraced the /. Rails gave us some strange, delightful, and unusually clever ideas. They weren't always perfect, but they sparked curiosity, and they left a mark. And Rails, it doesn't forget. Some ideas just need some time to come back around, because not everything in Rails is about forward motion. Some of the most interesting ideas in the framework are the ones we've circled back to, refined, renamed, and reimagined. These are the loops. The moments where Rails said, maybe we weren't wrong, we just weren't ready. Or where the community asked for a second or third time to try something better. Turbo is the latest stop in Rails' long tradition of asking, can we make the front end easier without going all in on JavaScript? We've been trying to avoid JavaScript forever. We've seen this before, remote true, unobtrusive JavaScript, observed field. Turbo builds on all those ideas, but with cleaner structure, modern browser APIs, and a bit more staying power, we hope. It lets us build fast, interactive experiences using mostly HTML, which is great, especially for teams that want to stay as much as they can in the Rails mindset. This is not Rails ignoring JavaScript, though. It's Rails simply saying, HTML might still be enough. And this is the most important refactoring, I think, of all time in Rails. For a long time, we had form for and form tag, and they worked, but they also forced us to explain things, like to the junior dev. Well, this one's for models, this one's not, unless you pass it a URL, and then it sort of is. Super easy. So even eventually Rails said, let's make this easier. So we got form with one helper, consistent behavior. Not because the old way was broken, but because Rails keeps revisiting its decisions. And sometimes the kindest thing that we can do for our future selves and developers is to reduce friction whenever we have an opportunity to do so. Now, when I first pitched this talk, I thought I'd be digging through a trough of Rails features that we could all be laughing here about. You know, semicolon roots, RJS, Axis Hasselhoff. But the more I look back, the more I realized that we were never laughing at the code. We were laughing with each other. Because Rails took care of the hard stuff, the boilerplate, the wiring. And that meant that we had more mental space to think about the product, to care about the user experience, to argue about button copy instead of database schemas. Rails didn't just make us more productive. It made us feel like we could build anything. And it attracted people who wanted to move fast, who cared about the bigger picture, not just the code, but what the code could do for us. So before we roll into this in memoriam, it's the second one of the day, I think, let's remember, these features weren't just tools, they were our momentum. Cue the music. Let's take a quiet moment to remember the features that once lived in our Rails apps. Some were brilliant. Some were brief, but all of them meant well. They may be gone from the framework, but they live on in our Git history, in outdated blog posts, and in the hearts of developers stuck maintaining 2011 era code bases. May they rest on rubygems.org. These weren't failures. They're reminders that Rails is alive and always learning. Ideas return when the time is right. And when they do, they come back lighter, cleaner, and better shape for the world that we're building in now. Remember that train ride I mentioned? In 2006, 16 of us boarded the Amtrak in Portland, Oregon, and took it to Chicago, Illinois, a 48-hour ride to the very first RailsConf. No Wi-Fi, no iPhones existed, no Git, no access to download Ruby gems. Only whatever we had saved in our vendor folder. Just laptops, script server, console demos, and a cooler full of questionable beverages. But more than that, we had momentum, a shared sense that something was about to take off. And look at that kid. Don't do it. So here we are at our final stop. But if you've been on the Rails train for any amount of time, you know there's no true last stop, because Rails keeps moving. Not just adding, but editing. Not just new ideas, better ones. This whole ride we've been on, it's not been about the features. It's been about how Rails learns. Rails doesn't just move forward, it loops, it reflects, it circles back, not out of nostalgia, but with clear eyes, and that's rare. Most frameworks chase trends. Rails asks, where's the friction, and how can we make it feel effortless again? Because that's where the joy lives. And every few years, something we thought was essential starts to feel unnecessary. A tool that used to save us time, now it's slowing us down. A pattern that seemed so elegant, now it's hard to explain to the new hire. Rails has taught us that these good defaults often come from hard-earned lessons. So the question is, what are we clinging on to today that we're going to be laughing about fondly in 5 years? Rails doesn't need to be cool again. It needs to be clear. Clear about what it values, clear about who it's for, and clear that the joy of building isn't a phase, it's the point. Thank you. If you've enjoyed the ride, please remember to tip your conductor, or at least leave a good commit message. Thanks for riding along with me today. If you have any questions or want to come say hi, come please see me around the conference. And remember, it's okay to laugh at your old code, just as long as you keep writing new code worth laughing about someday. And before I step off the stage, one last thing. I've been collaborating with the Rails Foundation on a new podcast. It's called On Rails. We have one episode out with Rosa that came out a week or two ago. It's not about the hype or news. It's about the real stuff, how teams actually build, adapt, and keep their production Rails apps running smoothly. If this sounds like your thing, I hope you give it a listen. Thanks again.